From 11th of November to 22nd of November 2024, COP29 is being hosted by Azerbaijan. The prime focus, the central focus of this COP29 is to finalize an agreement on Climate Finance Action Fund, particularly for the post-2025 period. Delegates from around 200 countries, business leaders, climate scientists, indigenous people, journalists and various other experts from different parts of the world are expected to attend this summit. And the primary goal of this COP29 is to bring different industry leaders, different countries together to develop a shared plan to combat the problem of climate change and also to curb the spread of global warming, which is spreading like wildfire throughout the earth. Now, what is the COP29? Why it is relevant? Why it is important? What are the underlying climate change agreements under this COP and why India is related to COP and what is the relation of India amongst all of these things? All these things we'll be trying to understand in this particular session. Also, a special focus would be on important COP summits, which has been there since the last 30 years. Hello, my name is Preetpal Singh and you are watching Perspective. Now, without beating around the bush, let us first try to answer the question that what is the COP?
India does not accept the goal proposal in its present form.
COP29 summit in Azerbaijan has agreed to a compromise deal on climate financing.
The developing nations say the annual $300 billion pledged by wealthier countries to help them cope with climate change is nowhere near enough. So how significant is this deal?
Regret to say that this document is nothing more than an optical illusion. This, in our opinion, will not address the enormity of the challenge we all face. Therefore, we oppose the adoption of this document. We oppose the adoption of this document.
See, the full form is Conference of Parties. That is a conference of different parties, different countries or different members of a particular treaty. Now, what treaty we'll be trying to understand? So, this Conference of Parties COP is an annual meeting of the UNFCCC, that is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, this was an international agreement which was signed in the year 1992 that has provided the basis for climate negotiations throughout the world. Now, this Framework Convention on Climate Change was open to signature on 19th of June 1992 at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, that is UNCED Summit, also known as Rio Earth Summit, which is a very popular summit. So in this Rio Earth Summit, that is UNCED Summit, there was one agreement, that was UNFCCC 1 convention, that is Framework Convention on Climate Change. Alongside this, there were two other conventions as well, part of this UNCED. So for understanding it in a better way, there was UNCED conference, also known as Rio Earth Summit. In that summit, there were different conventions which were passed, or there were different conventions which were opened. One convention was the Convention on Climate Change. Now, second convention was the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. We also call it as UNCBD. And the third convention was UN Convention on Combating Desertification. So that is UNCCD. Now, out of these three, the first one, that is the Framework Convention, it was entered into force on 21st of March 1994. That is 2 years after this. And this UNFCCC, it established the foundational principles on international climate action. See, climate change is a very big problem for the world. To combat this problem in 1990s, once the efforts were started, this UNFCCC laid basically the foundation stone for all these negotiations. See, climate change is a very important issue, and the need to tackle the issue of climate change was felt as early as 1990s.
Wind is the driving force behind our weather. It's part of what turns a sunny day into a stormy one, but climate change is altering wind patterns.
Winds will change as temperatures rise.
In the United States, hurricanes are getting more powerful, devastating ever larger areas. Weather disasters are also becoming more common in Europe, in part because climate change is affecting the jet stream. Strong winds 10 kilometers above the ground.
Enormous amounts of carbon are stored here. Some is locked in permafrost. Were the permafrost to melt, massive amounts of carbon would likely be released into the atmosphere, accelerating climate change. But it's not too late yet.
Now in 1990s, there was one agreement, that is UNFCCC, that was the pioneer, or that laid the bedrock from which different initiatives, different efforts throughout the world would start to combat climate change and to reduce the level of global warming. So from UNFCCC, all of these things started. And amongst all these principles, the chief principle was one, that all the countries, they're having common but differentiated responsibilities and also respective capabilities. So it recognized the fact that all the countries, they share the responsibility to tackle climate change, share the responsibility to tackle global warming, but they're having differentiated responsibilities. That is, their obligation differs according to their capacities and according to their circumstances. So there is shared responsibility, common but different. Also, this UNFCCC, it commits the members or the parties to act together to stabilize the greenhouse gas emissions. And currently there are 198 parties involved in this UNFCCC. 197 countries are there, and another member is European Union, so which is constituting a near universal membership of this UNFCCC. Almost all the countries in the world are part of it. And every year, since the year 1995, except in 1 year, that was 2020, that was due to coronavirus, except this, all the years from 1995 till now, there is Conference of Party Summit, that is annual summit, annual meeting of under this UNFCCC framework. So under this UNFCCC framework, when the parties meet regularly every year annually, that conference is known as Conference of Parties, COP. And the numbers are designated, that is COP 28, COP 29, COP 27. So these are the number of times they have met. And one of the major tasks of the COP is to review the national communications and emission inventories, which are submitted by the member states to UNFCCC. Now let's talk about the Conference of Parties, which was most important. And that again laid the foundation stone. That was COP3, Conference of Parties, third. And it happened in Kyoto, Japan. And under this, there was one protocol, or there was one agreement, which we call as Kyoto Protocol, a very important and a very popular protocol. Now this protocol, Kyoto Protocol, is also referred to as the first greenhouse gas emission reduction treaty in the world. So it was the first treaty which talked about greenhouse gas emissions and its reductions, and it introduced legally binding targets. So the targets which it introduced were legally binding specifically for developed nations. So responsibility was of developed nations first to tackle the climate change and to tackle the reduction of greenhouse gases. Now this international treaty, that is Kyoto Protocol, it placed obligations on set of rich and industrialized nations so that they cut their greenhouse gas emissions to a certain extent, to a certain level. Now these targets, they varied country by country depending on their circumstances, depending on their level and finances. It varied from country to country, but on an average, it was 4.2% reduction. Under Kyoto Protocol, these rich and industrialized countries, they were given a target of, on an average, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 4.2% by 2012, below the 1990 levels. And it was happening in 1995. So target was given till 2012. That till 2012, you reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 4.2% to the levels of 1990. And this move again reinforced that principle which we earlier discussed of common but a differentiated responsibility, which was set on in the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, under this Kyoto Protocol, there were certain gases which were targeted. So, Kyoto Protocol emission target gases, it included your CO2, SF6, CH4, HFCs, N2O and PFCs, and it also included flexible market mechanisms. That is, countries bound under this Kyoto targets, they can meet a part of their target through 3 market-based mechanisms. First market-based mechanism was Clean Development Mission, CDM, very important. Second one was emission trading, or we also call it as cap and trade. And third one was joint implementation, JI. And all these 3 were the part of market mechanisms or part of flexible market mechanisms under Kyoto Protocol. See, one thing is very clear. Since it was targeting mostly rich and developed countries and industrialized nations, it would not last very long. And that is what happened. See, this Kyoto Protocol, it could not last long because rich and powerful nations, they were not very happy with it. For example, United States, they signed the protocol but they never ratified it. And eventually after this 1995, eventually in COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009, the parties again they tried to reach a succession or to reach a successor treaty. But at COP15 happening in Copenhagen in 2009, the parties again met and they thought that okay, 2012 target which we set out to achieve will not be achieved. So what should we do? So they thought that we should set another treaty, we should sign another treaty which will be revising the targets and which will be a little bit different than the Kyoto Protocol. So basically the motive was to establish a successor treaty. But in this summit also, in Copenhagen summit as well, the negotiations failed. A legally binding agreement could not be arrived at the summit. Why? The reason was the disagreement between the developed nations and the developing nations. And eventually the summit ended with a COP note known as Copenhagen Accord, which was a 5-nation accord between US and basic countries which included India, China, Brazil and South Africa. And under this, developed countries, they promised to provide $30 billion for the period of 2010 to 2012 to mobilize long-term finance, and further $100 billion a year by 2020 from variety of sources. That was a part of this Copenhagen summit. Now a second attempt again was made at COP21 in Paris. We call it very popularly as the Paris Summit of 2015.
Paris is known as the City of Light. The City of Light is now more than ever a beacon of hope for the world, lighting the way towards the betterment of humanity. There is no doubt that the global climate change agreement we seek must be part of what Paris has become.
And it led to signing of a very landmark agreement known as Paris Agreement. Now, Paris Agreement again was a legally binding agreement, a legally binding treaty, and the aim was to reduce or limit the global temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably below 1.5 degrees Celsius to the pre-industrial levels. That was the main motive highlighted under the Paris Agreement. And also the parties, the member countries, they decided that they will be submitting their climate action plans known as Nationally Determined Contributions, NDCs, by 2020. So what are NDCs? This Nationally Determined Contributions, they are basically the pledges made by the countries to reduce the greenhouse gas levels, greenhouse gas emissions, and to adopt to the impacts of climate change. That was a part of this National Determined Contributions. Now let's wait for a moment and talk about India. Now India was also a party to this Paris Agreement, and going by this Paris Agreement, India came up with its Nationally Determined Contributions as well, and it comprised of 2 quantifiable targets. First was to reduce the emission intensity of its GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030 from the 2005 levels. That was the first target. Second target was to achieve about 40% of cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel-based sources by 2030. That was the second target, to achieve 40% of the cumulative electric power through non-fossil fuel-based sources by 2030. As a matter of fact, while we are talking, these 2 targets have been achieved. So these 2 targets were achieved ahead of its time. And as on 31st of October 2023, the cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel-based sources in our country is 186.4 megawatts, which is 43.8% of the total cumulative electric power installed capacity in India. And as per the third national communication which was submitted by India to the UNFCCC on December of 2023, the energy intensity of the GDP has been reduced by 33% between 2005 to 2019. So India has achieved both the targets which it laid down under Paris Agreement as a part of nationally determined contributions. Now in August of 2022, India updated its nationally determined contributions, according to which the target to reduce emission intensity as a part of its GDP has been enhanced to 45% by the year 2030 from the 2005 levels. And also the target of cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel-based sources, it has been enhanced to 50% by the year 2030. Already above 40% we are, now the target is 50%. Until now, we are talking about Paris Agreement, which was COP21 happening in 2015. But after this, there is again one more conference, COP that happened in Glasgow, Scotland, and that is COP26.
We have great opportunity in Saudi Arabia.
I see cows in a pivotal position.
And under Glasgow Summit, there was Glasgow Pact which was initiated, and the parties, they made a commitment to phase down the use of coal. Now the language was weakened from earlier. The word which was used was phase out, but eventually the word which was eventually used was phase down. So phase down the use of coal and to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And this was the first time when a United Nations climate agreement explicitly mentioned coal and talked about coal. And in the same COP26 in Glasgow, our Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji highlighted Panch Amrita goals. That is 5 commitments made by India to combat the issue of climate change and to reduce global warming. So under Panch Amrit, we made 5 commitments. First commitment is that India will reach its non-fossil energy capacity to 500 gigawatts by 2030. Second is that India will meet 50% of its energy requirements from renewable energy by the year 2030. Third is India will reduce the total projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tons from now to 2030. Fourth is that by 2030, India will reduce the carbon intensity of its economy to less than 45%. And the last one, the fifth one, is that by the year 2070, India will achieve the target of net zero emissions. That is the most important of all, that net zero emissions by 2070 India is going to achieve. That is a part of Panch Amrita. That is 5 commitments made by our Prime Minister, made by India in this Glasgow summit.
Prime Minister has announced India will set its net zero targets 2 decades after the timeline set by global scientists. Narendra Modi defended the target at the COP26 climate talks. He said India has stuck to its climate pledges and that the country was responsible for only 5% of global emissions.
Now, after Glasgow summit last year, there was COP28, which happened in Dubai. And in that summit, one prominent thing was a loss and damage fund was officially launched.
I want to acknowledge His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, President of the United Arab Emirates, whose vision, guidance, and unwavering support gave us the confidence to aim for the highest ambition.
Now, this fund is meant to provide financial help, financial assistance to countries which are stuck by climate disasters. And right now, there is COP29, which is happening and hosted by Azerbaijan.
Coming up.
Here we say rich countries would have to pay up, pay up for their climate debt.
This is not a matter of lack of money.
The planet's loudest voices and brightest minds.
What do we want?
Converge in Baku for COP29.
The issue is climate financing. You see, climate change did not begin in the last decade or even the last 20 years. The developing nations asked for $1.3 trillion every year. 1.3 trillion every year. The rich nations did not agree. This led to weeks of bitter negotiations. The developing countries walked out of the room.
Now, since we have seen the chronology and since we know the important conference of parties which has happened, what happened in those COPs and how India's contribution has made a significant impact in it, after this, the real question is that what is in store for COP29? See, under this COP29, climate finance is at top of the agenda. The parties are negotiating for a new collective quantifiable goal, that is NCQG, and they are figuring out a new amount that must be mobilized by the developed countries every year from 2025 onwards to finance the climate action in developing countries. And definitely it has to be more than the $100 billion which was earlier set out. However, the talks on this NCQG in the recent months, they have been very divided. Parties, they disagree on almost every element of the fund, especially including the amount of money which needs to be raised. And the question of who is to be contributing, what type of fund should feed into it, and what it should fund, and what would be the time period it should cover. Under all these questions, there are disagreement between countries, disagreement between parties. Now, it remains to be seen that how these member countries are able to finalize this fund and are able to mobilize these funds for the betterment of the developing nations and for combating climate change. So, in relation to climate financing, one thing was very clear, that the COP29 will be a very significant one and will be very important one. So we have to keep an eye on this, that what is the outcome of the COP29. And now, since we have had a brief discussion on all of the COPs which has happened till now, all the major COPs which has happened till now, and we also know that how the world has moved from 1995 Kyoto Protocol till now, that is COP29, which is in relation to climate finance. One thing which again we need to understand is what are the major criticisms of COP? See, because one thing is very clear. Most of the times the targets which we have set out to achieve as a part of this Conference of Parties under UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, most of the targets we have not been able to achieve. And we have underachieved our targets, which is why climate change problem currently is a major issue which is plaguing the whole world, especially the developing countries, because they don't have the resources to combat climate change. So here the biggest criticism of the COP is that it has failed to enable enough emission cuts to put the planet on a pathway to meet this target of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius targets. And various studies have shown that the world must cut its emission by at least 43%, emission of these greenhouse gases by at least 43% by the year 2030 relative to 2019 levels, keeping any hopes alive for achieving this 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And it is already 2024 and the world majorly has not even begun the downward journey. We have not even started yet. And the road ahead is again not very easy but very difficult. See, emissions are currently also rising and they have not yet peaked, but definitely in future a time will come where the emissions will be peaking. And if we see the best case scenarios, the global emissions are projected to be reduced by just 2%. So it will be just 2% below the 2019 levels by 2030 instead of 45%, which we need to in order to achieve this 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius target. And also one more thing is that COP has been unable to provide climate fund to the developing nations. For instance, in 2009, the wealthiest countries, which are disproportionately more responsible for the climate crisis, that every year from 2020 for developing nations will be raising $100 billion to help them reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and fund this climate action of theirs. But they have failed to deliver on this promise, as we see in the reality. Now the condition is such that the developing nations, they are demanding close to $1 trillion annually from the year 2026, with the G77 even calling for $1.3 trillion so that they can go ahead with climate action. And they insist that the finance must be new, it must be predictable and non-debt inducing. So it should not induce any form of debt to these countries. And it should be specifically targeting the climate action rather than investing in the clean technology. So because climate action is different, but investments in cleaner technology is different, counted towards the existing commitments. And in all of these things, definitely India plays a very key role, very pivotal role. India's role remains very proactive and very vigilant. See, we are again expected to achieve the targets which we have set. Definitely, we have to do a lot more as a country in order to reduce the carbon emissions, reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, and combat the menace of climate change. But still, we are doing decently well. Scope of improvement is definitely there, and we need to take different other measures with our Ministry of Environment and Climate Change also paving a way for it, and also different other parts of our country and the world coming together to combat this menace of climate change. See, the climate crisis is very real and the time to act really is now. And it is not just for us. It is for our future generations. It is for our children, our grandchildren, and for a sustainable future. So to ensure this, the world must come together and act rather than just talk. I hope you gained a new perspective from this discussion around COP Conference of Parties, and I hope you gained some new knowledge. Please let me know in the comment section what are your views that how climate change can be combated and how COP can be made more efficient and what can be done more in this Conference of Parties. I'll be very happy to see your suggestions. All the very best and have a beautiful day. Thank you.